Most people think global power is decided by armies, by borders, by elections, by treaties. In reality, power is now decided somewhere else, inside supply chains, inside energy systems, inside technology rules. Over the past few years, governments across the United States, Europe, and other advanced economies have begun reshaping how power actually works. Not through war, not through speeches, but through economics. The world is not becoming less global, it is becoming more controlled. And most people don't yet realize what that means. For most of modern history, power was visible. It lived in parliaments, in presidential offices, in military command rooms. When governments wanted to project influence, they did it through diplomacy, sanctions, or force. Power was exercised openly, and it was understood in political terms. That model no longer describes how the world actually works. Today, power has moved into systems. It lives inside supply chains that determine which countries can manufacture critical goods, inside energy networks that decide who can keep their economies running, inside technology standards that shape how data flows across borders. These systems are not controlled by speeches, they are controlled by rules. Over the past decade, governments across the United States, Europe, and other advanced economies have quietly realized something. Geopolitics is no longer only about territory, it is about access. Access to semiconductors, access to rare earth minerals, access to energy, access to logistics, access to platforms. When access is restricted, power shifts. A factory that cannot source components does not operate. An energy grid without fuel does not function. A technology company without market access does not scale. This is why economic systems are now treated as strategic assets. Trade is no longer just commerce, it is leverage. Energy is no longer just infrastructure, it is security. Technology is no longer just innovation, it is influence. The world did not suddenly become more hostile, it became more interdependent. And interdependence creates vulnerability. That vulnerability is now where power is exercised. Not loudly, not visibly, but structurally. For decades, global markets were treated as self-correcting. If one country stopped producing, another would step in. If prices rose, supply would follow. If disruptions occurred, efficiency would restore balance. This belief shaped the modern global economy. Production moved wherever labor was cheapest. Supply chains stretched across continents. Just-in-time logistics replaced stockpiles. The system was optimized for cost, not for resilience. Then the shocks began. First, the financial crisis exposed how tightly connected markets had become. Then trade disputes revealed how easily supply chains could be weaponized. Then the pandemic showed how fragile global logistics really were. Factories shut down, ports froze, medical supplies ran out, food systems strained. Governments discovered that markets did not recover quickly under stress. They stalled. And when they stalled, entire economies slowed with them. Semiconductors could not reach car manufacturers. Energy shortages shut down industrial production. Shipping delays drove inflation. What was once efficient became fragile. What was once cheap became risky. This forced a fundamental rethink. Economic policy was no longer just about growth. It became about continuity. Governments began asking new questions. What happens if a rival nation controls a critical input? What happens if a war disrupts shipping lanes? What happens if a pandemic freezes transport again? Markets had no answers, because markets are not designed for national security. They are designed for profit. That realization changed everything. Global trade did not collapse, but blind dependence did. Efficiency was no longer the top priority. Stability was. And once stability becomes the goal, power begins moving back into the hands of the state. Once global markets stopped feeling safe, governments did not panic. They planned. Quietly, methodically, and with long-term intent. The first move was not nationalization, it was leverage. States began using money, law, and regulation to reshape behavior. Subsidies were redirected towards strategic industries. Tax incentives were redesigned to attract domestic production. Public investment was aimed at technologies that private capital hesitated to fund. Semiconductors, energy infrastructure, critical minerals, advanced manufacturing. These were no longer treated as ordinary sectors, they became strategic assets. In the United States, industrial policy returned under new language. In Europe, state aid rules were rewritten. In the United Kingdom, economic security entered trade policy. In Canada and Australia, supply chain resilience became a national priority. This was not coordination, it was convergence. Different governments, facing the same vulnerabilities, reached the same conclusion. Markets alone could not guarantee continuity. So governments stepped in, not to replace markets, but to steer them. They shaped where factories were built. They influenced which technologies received funding. They protected industries that could not be allowed to fail. This changed the structure of capitalism, not by abolishing competition, but by guiding it. Private companies still invest, still innovate, still compete, but now they do so inside frameworks designed by the state. Economic geography is no longer determined only by cost, it is shaped by policy. Capital no longer flows only toward efficiency. It flows toward stability. This is not a return to central planning, it is something new. A system where markets operate, but governments quietly write the boundaries. And once those boundaries are set, they define the economy for decades. For most of modern history, regulation had one job: to limit what companies could not do, what markets could not become, what risks could not be taken. Today, regulation does something very different. It shapes outcomes. Governments no longer use rules only to prevent harm. They use them to direct behavior, to influence where capital flows, to determine which technologies scale, to decide which business models survive. In the United States and Europe, regulation now defines entire industries. Technology platforms operate under competition law, designed to break dominance. Financial institutions operate inside risk frameworks built after systemic collapse. Energy markets operate under emissions targets that reshape investment. These are not constraints, they are steering mechanisms. When governments rewrite regulatory frameworks, companies do not protest and exit. They adapt. They reorganize supply chains. They redirect capital. They redesign products. Regulation now signals intent. It tells markets what future governments are building toward: green energy, domestic manufacturing, data sovereignty, financial stability. Each regulatory shift redraws the economic map. And because regulation is technical, it moves quietly. No speeches, no rallies, no slogans. Just thousands of pages of law that restructure incentives. This is how power is exercised in modern economies. Not through ownership, not through command, but through architecture. The rules define the game, and those who write the rules control the field. This is governance without spectacle. And once established, it is extraordinarily difficult to reverse. Because markets can adapt to new rules, but they cannot function without them. This transformation is not ideological. It is not a return to socialism. It is not a rejection of capitalism. And it is not a political experiment. It is a response to constraint. For decades, advanced economies operated under conditions that no longer exist. Stable globalization, cheap energy, predictable geopolitics, low inflation, abundant labor. Those foundations have fractured. Supply chains proved fragile. Energy became strategic. Technology became geopolitical. Capital became cautious. The system that once optimized for efficiency is now exposed to risk. And markets are not designed to manage national vulnerability. They minimize cost. They do not protect sovereignty. They do not secure strategic capacity. They do not guarantee resilience. Governments now face problems markets cannot solve alone. How to secure semiconductor supply. How to protect critical infrastructure. How to maintain industrial capacity. How to manage technological dependence. These are not commercial questions. They are state questions. And states act when survival is involved. This is why policy has shifted across democracies simultaneously. The United States, the European Union, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia. Different governments, different ideologies, same direction. Because the constraints are structural. Globalization has slowed. Geopolitical rivalry has intensified. Demographics are tightening labor markets. Climate risk is reshaping energy systems. The old model assumed stability. The new reality is volatility. And volatility requires management. What we are witnessing is not interventionism. It is adaptation. The economic architecture is being redesigned for a more dangerous world. Not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently. The future economy will not be less capitalist. It will be more managed. Markets will continue to allocate resources, but they will operate inside boundaries shaped by state strategy. This changes how growth happens. Efficiency will matter less than security. Speed will matter less than stability. Cost will matter less than control. For businesses, this means policy becomes part of competition. Investment decisions will depend on subsidies. Factory locations will follow incentives. Technology development will follow regulation. Capital will no longer flow only toward cheap labor and low taxes. It will flow toward political alignment and strategic protection. For workers, industrial geography returns. Manufacturing clusters will reform. Energy regions will re-emerge. Technology corridors will expand. Jobs will follow policy. For governments, economic power becomes a tool of diplomacy. Trade becomes leverage. Supply chains become alliances. Investment becomes influence. Economic relationships are no longer neutral. They are strategic. This does not mean the end of globalization. It means its reorganization. Less about efficiency, more about reliability. Less about openness, more about trust. Over time, this will produce a different world economy. More regional, more regulated, more politically shaped. Growth may be slower, but shocks will be less destabilizing. Innovation may be more targeted, but systems will be harder to break. The invisible hand has not disappeared, but it no longer acts alone. The state is now a permanent participant, and that changes the balance of economic power for the next generation. The global economy is not being transformed by crisis alone. It is being redesigned by choice, quietly, incrementally, through policy rather than proclamation. Governments are no longer standing at the edge of markets, they are standing inside them. Not to replace competition, not to dismantle capitalism, but to shape the conditions under which it operates. This is not a temporary intervention. It is a permanent shift in economic governance. The rules that once evolved slowly through trade and technology are now being rewritten through legislation, regulation, and strategy. Factories follow subsidies. Supply chains follow security alliances. Capital follows political certainty. The map of global production is changing, not because markets failed, but because the risks became too large to ignore. Energy, technology, food, data. These are no longer just economic assets, they are instruments of power. And power, once rediscovered, is rarely surrendered. The world is entering an era where prosperity is managed, growth is guided, and efficiency is balanced against resilience. This will not make economies simpler, it will make them more political. The real transformation is not in what governments are doing, it is in how permanent those actions are becoming. Markets will remain powerful, but they will no longer be sovereign. The age of economic neutrality is ending. The age of economic strategy has already begun. And the most important changes are happening long before most people notice. Breaking news is fast. Understanding takes time. If this helped you see the story more clearly, stay with us.